First of all, when I was reading this and you talked about Dawkins and the question of meaninglessness, I remember, like, in my teenage years, I was enamored with Bertrand Russell. He was my hero till I outgrew him. And his essay, A Free Man's Worship, was exactly what you talk about with Dawkins. It is that we live in a meaningless universe and have to create our own meaning. And I found that heroic at the time, although now I don't. Also, I found out what kind of life he lived.
Yes.
It wasn't very admirable. But I think that part of the reason that people like Russell, and maybe Dawkins, I don't know, wrote this is because while we praise the West, it's not just that the West has done terrible things in the past, but as you point out in this book, the most developed country in the West up to that time was Germany. And look what they did.
Yep.
So how is it that we are supposed to want to return to the values of the West?
Exactly. Well, I think that is, for me, the great watershed. I mean, when one looks at why the West has become has turned on itself in this self-destructive way, you can certainly take it back to the Enlightenment, and you can find the tributaries of thought that contributed to this self-destructive way of thinking. But for me, the great watershed was the Holocaust, because I think that at that point, the West became demoralized in both senses of the word. Demoralized in the sense of losing the will to live, and demoralized in that it lost its morality as a result of losing the will to live. Why? Because the Holocaust did not happen in some benighted backwater of the world. It happened at the very acme, the very apex of high Western culture. Germany thought of itself as the acme of rationality. The Germans, were so cultured, and they revered Schiller and Goethe, and they were so proud of them, and music, classical music. I mean, it was the last word in high culture and rationality. And so I think the West basically said to itself, when the full enormity of what had happened became apparent, I think the West said to itself, we did this. It wasn't just that we turned away the Jewish refugees. It wasn't just that we appeased Hitler and we kind of contributed to what happened. That was all true as well. It was much deeper than that. It was, we did this because it was our society, our industrialized, scientific, advanced, rational, cultured society that did this. Modernity, Western modernity. So there's something wrong with Western modernity. And out of Germany came explicitly groups of radicals. One of them was called the Frankfurt School. I think they went to America. And they basically said, yeah, what have we been telling you all these years? Capitalism really sucks. It's terrible. We have to have a new world. And whereas previously, the rest of the West might have said, well, these people are just sort of ultra-leftists and they're the fringe. They were vulnerable because they thought, yeah, this is really, they really have a point. And so I think they became vulnerable to all the rubbish that came in that we are now living through. So one thing led to another.
And then the last question I want to ask before opening it up, and by the way, one thing I don't want to miss is you can follow Melanie Phillips on her Substack, which is www.melaniephillips.substack.com, and see her writings frequently. Is when I'm reading a book, especially if I'm nodding on many pages, I think, like, what would I say if I was the opposition to this book? And I think if I were a rabbi and I were opposed to it, I would say that what the left has a hold of, that the conservative world has not really come to grips to, is the prophetic tradition. That is the genuine concern. I mean, every Jewish community had what was called a tamchui, a public plate, which is essentially welfare. The concern for the widow, the orphan, the so on. I don't even hear that rhetoric from the right. I remember when George Bush talked about compassionate conservatism, I thought that could work. But without even the rhetoric of compassion, it is hard to believe that the right is really thinking about the widow and the orphan who deserve that help. So I wonder what you say to the social justice rabbi who says, I don't see that concern on the right.
Yeah. In a newspaper called The Times, which is The Times in London, I've written about this today, in fact, about the crisis of conservatism, because it's a crisis of conservatism throughout the West, because conservatism no longer, well, for many years, has not understood what it has to conserve. In Britain, which is, of course, the country I know best, what's been called conservatism for decades has been divided between two strands of thought. One strand is what I would call pseudo-universalist liberals. They're conservatives only marginally. I think you call them here rhinos, Republicans in name only. They basically subscribe to much of the way of thinking of the left, sort of universalist values. They signed up, or they either signed up to or went along with a lot of the ideologies on the left, partly because they thought they couldn't, like Canute, stand in the way of the tide of social progress and social change, and partly because they themselves believed in it, because they didn't have anything else to believe in. Why? Because the only alternative within the conservative family, within the conservative tribe in Britain, if you weren't a kind of universalist pseudo-liberal on that wing, you were a free marketeer. You saw the world entirely in terms of money, in terms of economics. Everything in the world that went wrong could be solved by the market. Mrs. Thatcher thought that. I wrote at the time, and I haven't changed my view. She was not a conservative. She was what was called in Britain a Manchester liberal. Don't ask why it's Manchester, but believe me, it was Manchester. She believed in, freedom. Now, if you believe in freedom, freedom is a great thing, but freedom is a means to an end, should be. Freedom should be the means to the end of creating a good society, of making people better people, of looking after other people. That's what you want freedom for. Freedom without that duty, that sense of duty and responsibility, freedom becomes at the most extreme end anarchy, and it certainly becomes selfish. So looking at conservatism in Britain, the Conservative Party in Britain, nobody is speaking outside those two traditions or those two ways of thinking, and so it's very, very un-Jewish. So the Jewish way, the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who we miss every day, I do, he got it. He got it. My goodness, he got it decades ago, and he wrote that what is needed is the politics of what he called covenant, which is absolutely right. In other words, there should be things which our political leaders are inspired by, driven by, are taking us towards, which go beyond the sort of conditionality of contract and selfishness and self-centeredness and in short-termism, and make unbreakable bonds of attachment and love to institutions and to values and to cultures and to the culture. Judaism is, as far as I can see, is fundamentally based on a sense of duty. You have a duty to the Almighty, to each other, to yourself, to better yourself, to live by certain rules which constrain you. And within those rules, you find political freedom, you find compassion, you find all those good things. But without those rules, you don't have them. And so that's the paradox, it seems to me.